Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Mountain, My Time on Everest, by Ed Viesturs with David Roberts, narrated by Tom Beyer. Introduction. Ed Viesturs is fond of twofers. No, not two burgers, but still two for the price of one. Ed's favored twofers are 8,000-meter peaks. A high-altitude mountaineer has to have a big appetite just to savor one a season. But two? Well, first, twofers nearly halve the cost. An even bigger advantage is being able to shuttle from Peak 1 to Peak 2 while already acclimatized and not too wasted from the first effort. This book, The Mountain, offers other twofers. Though it speaks to us with Ed's first-person voice, it has two authors, Viesturs and Dave Roberts, two brains speaking through one mouth. Ed and Dave are friends. Both are climbers, though from different generations. Roberts' profession has been as a writer and as a teacher of writing at Hampshire College. Over the course of 3 prior collaborations, they have achieved a symbiosis in which the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Another twofer in The Mountain. First is a rich and introspective account of Ed's 11 Everest expeditions, integrated seamlessly within the broader context of his mountain journeys and of the rest of his life. The other part of this twofer is a concise, compelling account of the history of our human affair with the highest mountain on Earth, from the discovery of Peak 15's height through early exploration to its first ascent in 1953, to the pioneering of new routes in new seasons and climbing in increasingly pure style. Viesturs is best known as the first American to climb all 14 of the 8,000-meter peaks. His quest was a tenacious 16-year commitment from Kanchenjunga in 1989 to Annapurna on his third attempt in 2005. One cannot but wonder what enables a few determined human beings to accomplish such a feat. From the perspective both of a climber and a high-altitude physiologist, I will speculate a bit on how Ed Viesturs and his select community of high-altitude wanderers managed to perform so well on 8,000-meter peaks without the use of supplemental oxygen. Are they a different beast from the average climber? In some ways, yes. In others, no. One difference is evolution in style. A half-century ago, as members of the 1963 American Mount Everest expedition, a few of us attempted a new route. Willie Unsold and I were indulging in brief bits of high-angle rock climbing on our summit day, with nearly 40 pounds of oxygen cylinders as ballast in our Kelty packs. Our use of supplemental oxygen effectively lowered the physiologic altitude, which presumably more than offset the weight handicap. In his seminal essay, Games Climbers Play, Lito Tejada Flores posited the need for uncertainty in climbing, and hence motivation, as Dick Emerson, our West Ridge sociologist teammate, opined. In 1963, there was plenty of uncertainty to keep us motivated, but each such element pushes back the boundaries of the unknown. To keep the outcome in doubt means ramping up the rules of the game. In mountaineering, that change has been toward a simpler, lighter, faster style. One example: Messner and Hobler's 1978 ascent of Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen represented a major paradigm shift in the style of high-altitude mountaineering. Of Ed's 7 successful ascents of Everest, he topped out on 3 occasions just breathing the air around him. When with clients, Ed believes the guide should also use oxygen to optimize the well-being of the entire team. Another big change in climbing these high mountains is the amount of time and effort committed to the task. Our 1963 expedition was gone from home for nearly 5 months, more than twice the time involved in an Everest climb nowadays. I remember coming down from our traverse of Everest in 1963 a tad tired and many pounds lighter. Part of the exhaustion was inherent in expedition-style climbing, which involved days and weeks of hanging out at high altitudes, humping loads, breaking trail, and putting in camps. In contrast, the current alpine style of light, fast ascents, once one is acclimatized, adds up to a lot less work and a lot less time spent physically and mentally deteriorating in the so-called death zone. Back then, mountain twofers were beyond imagination. Are individuals like Ed Viesturs different physiologically from others? Perhaps. Over a decade ago, my colleague Dr. Robert Brownie Shaney, a pulmonary and exercise doc at the University of Washington, put Viesturs through his paces on a treadmill, seeking an explanation for why Ed performs so well at extreme altitude. The findings? Ed's maximum work capacity is on par with that of an endurance athlete. His heart was able to deliver far more blood to exercising muscle than the average person's heart. But at extreme altitude, a person can only work at 20 to 25% of his or her sea level maximum. The heart's ability to pump far exceeds the demands placed upon it. More intriguing was Dr. Shaney's observation that Ed was able to perform sustained work at 85% of his maximum, VO2 max. Most mortals can manage only 55 to 60% of their maximum. Whether this difference in work capacity helps explain his exceptional high-altitude performance is an intriguing question that has yet to be investigated. Another critical factor that may help explain better performance at high altitude, or any altitude for that matter, is efficiency, the ability to perform work at a lower oxygen cost. One can perceive this gift of efficiency in the seemingly effortless movement of the virtuoso long-distance runner. Studies to quantify the contribution of efficiency to performance are not easy to design, yet that capacity to get a bigger bang for the oxygen buck is likely one more factor that separates the Viesturs of the high mountain world from the average climber. Although the physiology of exceptional human performance is intriguing, a lot of the story of such accomplishment comes from the mental side. Ed Viesturs began his high mountain quest one summit at a time. He found he was good at it, and his need for greater uncertainty morphed into his quest to climb all 14 8,000-meter peaks. And he wanted to do it without supplemental oxygen. His was not a unique goal. Reinhold Messner did it first, and Jerzy Kukuczka was not far behind. As I write, the 8,000-meter club is still pretty exclusive, numbering approximately 30 persons, only about half of whom, Ed among them, have climbed all 14 without supplemental oxygen. In that, he emulated Messner's style, and like Messner, he imposed his own personal limit on the amount of risk he was willing to accept. By the very nature of their activity, climbers are anything but risk-averse. but they differ greatly among themselves on just how much risk is palatable. At one extreme are the adrenaline junkies or stimulus addicts who, if their life is not on the thin edge, come away feeling unfulfilled. That group has a high mortality. The majority of committed climbers aren't that extreme. From my perspective, Ed Viesturs had, and has, a lower tolerance than most for the prospect of dying on a mountain. To have the will to turn around a few hundred yards short of the summits of Everest and Shishapangma, or to part company with his climbing partners on Annapurna and descend because he didn't feel the conditions were right, bespeaks a perspective on life in which the climbing of a mountain is just a part. That's often forgotten in the intensity of the moment. Perhaps out of all that Ed Viesturs has done in his climbing life, it's this uncommon attribute that impresses me the most. If I examine my own past sins, Willie Unsold and I might well be accused of throwing caution to the winds on our West Ridge climb in 1963. True, back then, our feeling that this was a one-shot opportunity was part of the underpinning, but the trade-off of a possibly shortened life simply did not intrude upon our thoughts. Ed seems different in the way he placed his passion into the context of life at large. Several efforts to analyze the relationship between climbing experience, measured by numbers of expeditions, and expedition outcome, defined by success in summiting and death rate, have come to a common and curious conclusion. Analysis of the Elizabeth Hawley Richard Salisbury database for all climbs on 8,000-meter peaks in Nepal has found that though the probability of reaching the summit increases appreciably with increasing experience, the likelihood of dying appears to be unrelated to the amount of experience. The reasons for this are unclear. Experience is not the same thing as one's willingness or unwillingness to accept risk. To my mind, Ed's thesis that the caution he has imposed upon his high-altitude sojourns has contributed to his long-term survival seems quite reasonable. But I have to think that there's been another ephemeral player in the game: luck. Luck is an unpredictable event that, like risk, can be bad or good, which happens to us and is not something of our making. It's pervasive in all aspects of our lives, including wandering among high Himalayan hills. On our 1963 American Mount Everest expedition, we had both extremes. Jake Breitenbach's death in the icefall was our biggest bad luck. Though not to downplay the role of commitment, our success on a new route on Everest and our survival of an unintended bivouac above 28,000 feet were in no small part a consequence of good luck, with near-ideal conditions at critical moments. Looking again at Liz Hawley's database, for about 60 attempts on our West Ridge route over the ensuing half-century, a 10% success rate, with deaths exceeding the number summiting, gives a sense that we just happened to be in the right place at the right time. We were lucky. The word luck does not feature much in Ed's personal account, but it seems to me an inescapable complement to his approach to the world's highest places. It's clear from Ed Viesturs' 11 journeys to Everest that this mountain holds a special place among his high-altitude wanderings. I hope you will be as entranced as I by his account of his affair with this thinnest of air. Tom Hornbein, Estes Park, Colorado, May 2013. 1. So close, and yet. The first time I tried to climb Mount Everest was in the spring of 1987. It was a very different mountain then from the swarmed-over scene it's become today. By that spring, there had been only 209 successful ascents of the mountain by 191 different climbers. A single person, the Sherpa Sungdare, had reached the summit as many as 4 times. It's become almost impossible nowadays to keep track of Everest statistics, but by the end of May 2012, the number of successful ascents was in the vicinity of 6,000, performed by about 3,500 climbers. 2 indefatigable veterans, Apa Sherpa and Purba Tashi Sherpa, have now reached the top of the world 21 times each. In the spring of 2012, there were more than 30 different expeditions simultaneously trying to climb Everest via the South Col route, the line by which it was first ascended by Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary in 1953. I saw photos on the internet of as many as 150 climbers on the Lhotse face, lined up like depression job seekers in a free lunch queue, as they jumarred their way up the fixed ropes. In contrast, on the north side of Everest in the spring of 1987, there were only 3 teams. Ours hoped to climb the Great Couloir from the head of the central Rongbuk Glacier. A Swedish team had chosen the traditional route from the North Col up the Northeast Ridge, and a Canadian, Roger Marshall, was attempting a bold solo ascent via the Japanese and Hornbein couloirs, a route nicknamed the Super Direct. In 1987, I myself was a different person from the mountaineer who, 18 years later, would become the first American to get to the top of all 14 peaks in the world higher than 8,000 meters, 26,246 feet. I was 27 years old, and though I'd climbed Denali in Alaska twice and had served for 5 years as a guide on Mount Rainier, this was my first expedition to an 8,000er. No matter how much I'd read about Everest, I was awed by the scale and majesty of the mountain, and not at all sure I was up to the challenge of scaling its north face by the Great Couloir. The expedition was put together by Eric Simonson, a seasoned veteran who was also my fellow guide for Rainier Mountaineering Incorporated, RMI. Although Eric was only 4 years older than I, he had been guiding since 1973, and I looked up to him as a mentor. He'd already been to Everest in 1982 with a team led by our RMI boss, Lou Whitaker, that reached 27,500 feet on the same route, still 1,500 feet short of the summit. Eric had been hampered by a bad knee after a falling rock struck him high on this daunting face, and in 1987 he was determined to give it another shot. Our expedition was a bit of a boondoggle, for a climber from Arkansas named Jack Alsup had approached Eric offering to raise all the funds and pay all the expenses for 5 RMI guides if we'd serve as glorified Sherpas for him and his buddies. The deal was that we guides would fix ropes, establish camps, and carry loads up the route, but not actually guide the Arkansas gang on their attempt, simply set them up so they could make their own independent push toward the summit. The official name of our team was the Arkansas Everest Expedition. Quite an irony, here I was, a guy who had escaped the flatlands of the Midwest to immerse myself in the rich Pacific Northwest climbing culture, only to be going on my first Everest expedition with a team based in the South. I was grateful to be invited by Eric, who 2 years earlier had chosen me to serve as his assistant guide on a traverse of Denali with clients. For Everest, Eric also picked my fellow RMI guides, Greg Wilson, George Dunn, and Craig Van Hoy. A free trip to Everest. Who wouldn't jump at that opportunity? Once our team was assembled, all 5 of us plunged into gear selection and packing, but Eric took on the brunt of the logistical work. A smart, analytical fellow, he's good at that sort of thing. JanSport jumped aboard as an expedition sponsor, supplying clothing, tents, and packs. They also offered to have our high-altitude suits custom-made by an experienced local seamstress. I was pretty excited at the thought of getting a high-tech suit for an attempt on the summit. I imagined an extremely lightweight, trim-fitting down suit, like the ones I'd seen Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler wearing in photos from their path-breaking climb of Everest without supplemental oxygen in 1978. Only a day or two before we had to leave Seattle, Eric and I drove up to our seamstress's house to collect the suits. When I hefted mine, my jaw nearly hit the floor. The suits were filled with bulky synthetic insulation, and the outer fabric felt more like canvas than lightweight nylon. Unnecessary doodads, such as stripes winding around the sleeves, added another heavy layer to the already bloated suits. Rather than the sleek Maserati outfits I had fantasized about, we had no choice but to head off to Everest with these cumbersome monstrosities. I was just finishing my doctorate in veterinary medicine at Washington State University in Pullman, out on the state's eastern plains. I envisioned a career as a vet, although climbing was my true passion. To leave for Everest in March, I had to rearrange my senior year schedule so that I could graduate 2 months early. Fortunately, my classmates and teachers fully supported my hobby, going so far as to buy expedition T-shirts. Still, in 1987, I could not have dreamed of making a living as a mountaineer. As it was, earning a modest income guiding on Rainier in the summers, but pouring that money into my tuition bills, I was living as cheaply as I could, renting a room in the Seattle home of my buddy Steve Swaim, who ran his own veterinary clinic. Just before the expedition, a woman I'd been involved with for 2 years abruptly broke off our relationship. I was hurt and baffled, but in another sense, comfortable with the freedom that gave me. I was fresh out of school, with no full-time job or major obligations, so taking off to Asia for an indeterminate length of time didn't bother me one bit. As I wrote in my diary at base camp, I guess my life's pretty simple and uncomplicated at this point. Yahoo! My Denali expeditions, the longest I'd been on so far, had each lasted about 3 weeks. But Everest in 1987 would turn into a 3-month-long ordeal by logistics, weather, and high-altitude conditioning. Literally 88 days round trip from Kathmandu. Although I'd never been above 20,320 feet, I'd already made up my mind to try Everest without bottled oxygen. The example of great mountaineers such as Messner had instilled in me a purist aesthetic. I didn't want to lower the mountain to my level simply to reach the summit, but rather to take on Everest at its level. And the prospect of having to carry oxygen bottles and wear an oxygen mask on my face, in effect isolating me from the mountain, was unappealing. Yet, having made that decision, I approached the challenge with a lot of trepidation and self-doubt. As early as March 28th, I wrote in my diary, "I still wonder what it's like up there without oxygen. Have to see how I do as we go higher. It'd be great to do it without O2. Gotta be strong, though, 'cause the summit day is gonna be an ass-buster, especially coming down wasted. Hope I at least get a chance for the top." Today, a truck road leads through Tibet from Nepal, and a spur leads straight to base camp on the north side of Everest. It's become a milk run, albeit a bureaucratically tangled one, for trekkers and climbers alike. But in 1987, the north side felt so isolated that Eric claimed it was like going off to the moon. The Great Couloir route that we were going to attack is not the easiest or safest way to climb Everest from the north. In 1924, the third British expedition to the mountain reached the North Col at 23,000 feet via the East Rongbuk Glacier, a hidden tributary that the reconnaissance expedition of 1921 had completely overlooked. From the North Col, a shallow spur leads up to the high crest of the Northeast Ridge. It was on this route that George Lee Mallory and Andrew Irvine went for the summit on June 8, 1924, and never returned, launching one of the great mysteries in mountaineering history. Our team, however, made no use of the East Rongbuk approach. Instead, we established an advanced base camp, ABC, at only 18,300 feet at the head of the Rongbuk Glacier proper. From there, the face sweeps up in a daunting rise of more than 10,000 feet to the distant summit. The face is also far more threatened by falling rocks and avalanches than the North Col Northeast Ridge route pioneered in 1924. Although Greg Wilson, George Dunn, and Eric Simonson had all tried Everest before without success, and all three desperately wanted to get to the top, Eric chose the harder North Face route because he wanted to finish the line that he and George had attempted in 1982. On a 3-month expedition, there are bound to be tensions among the climbers. We had a cordial but ambivalent relationship with the Swedish team. Although we shared some meals with them at base camp and benefited greatly from weather forecasts their team received from back home, we had an uneasy truce about the route itself. The Swedes planned to go up the East Rongbuk to the North Col and follow the Mallory-Irvine route along the Northeast Ridge. It was only late in the expedition that they changed their plans and decided to go diagonally across the north face and go for the top via the Great Couloir, thereby overlapping with our line on the upper half of the mountain. This worried us because it meant the Swedes would depend on our fixed ropes, and their presence in the Great Couloir might create additional hazards by virtue of having too many climbers on the same part of the mountain at the same time. As for the Arkansas gang, their sponsorship of our attempt was something of a mixed blessing. It's true that the 5 of us could not have afforded an Everest expedition on our own, and we were very grateful to have our way paid. But several of the Arkansas climbers were, frankly, too weak to have a chance on Everest, and the stronger ones were infected with a mild case of hubris, underestimating the difficulty of the route and overestimating their own strength and ability. In addition, tensions developed among our group of 5 guides. It was almost inevitable that the weeks of strain as we slowly advanced the route should produce conflicts. For various reasons, not everyone was able to contribute equally to that effort. That's a given on big expeditions. Good.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?